All right, welcome everybody. We are just letting people in from the waiting room now. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to get settled in. Just letting people in. And while you're waiting, before we get started, feel free to use the chat box and you can introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from, perhaps what interests you with today's webinar.
Yeah, I recognize a lot of names here. Thank you all for being here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Okay, well, everyone's come in from the waiting room, so I think we're going to get started and people might still be trickling in after this. Welcome again. This is the webinar featuring Ann Wright on U.S. militarism and war games in the Pacific, co-sponsored by the Florida chapter of World Beyond War and the Veterans for Peace chapter 136 in the Villages, Florida. Before we get started, a few Zoom logistics. Today's event will run for about 1 hour. We are recording today's event and we will send out an email afterwards with the recording. So if you have to leave at any time, no worries. You can use the chat box throughout the event to put your comments and questions, and we will get to those at the end. And if you haven't yet, I see people are just starting to, feel free to use the chat box now and introduce yourself. We do have closed captions enabled for today's event. You should be able to click the CC live transcript button to enable the captions if you'd like to view them. And if you don't see that button, sometimes you have to click the 3 dots in the bottom right corner of your screen to see more options. And a reminder that the captions are done by robots, so please excuse any errors with the transcription. And with that, I want to pass it over to Larry, who is a co-coordinator for the World Beyond War Florida chapter, and he will be introducing today's event. So go ahead, Larry.
Hello, everyone, and happy Cinco de Mayo. And it's my great pleasure and my honor to present to you retired Colonel Ann Wright, who will speak on the U.S. provocative actions on Taiwan and the massive increase in U.S. military operations in Western Pacific, including the upcoming Talisman Sabre ground war maneuvers in Australia in July, with over 33,000 U.S. and Australian military, including some NATO countries. So Ann Wright served 28 years in the U.S. Army and Army Reserves and retired as a colonel. She was also a U.S. diplomat for 16 years and served in the U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She resigned from the U.S. government 20 years ago in March of 2003 in opposition to the U.S. war on Iraq. She is a member of Veterans for Peace, CODEPINK, Women for Peace, World Beyond War, No to NATO, and is on the Advisory Council of the International Peace Bureau. She is the co-author of Dissent, Voices of Conscience. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to present to you Ann Wright. So welcome, Ann.
Well, thank you, Larry, and thanks to World Beyond War for hosting us for this webinar, and thanks for everyone for being concerned about what's going on out in the Western Pacific. I know we've got a lot of information about what's going on in Europe with the war in Ukraine, and every now and then there'll be something that'll pop up about the Western Pacific, Northeast Asia, China, and further down to Australia, but not a lot. So I really appreciate you all wanting to hear more about it. I'll do a little screen share right now with the presentation, and we'll see if we can get this going here. And I'll make these slides available to anyone that wants them. We'll put it in the end of the recording that we send out. We'll put all the link to this and some other actions that are going on in around the world, actually. So if you happen to be in Europe or out in the Western Pacific, we've got things for you to do, as well as right here in the United States. So I'll be talking about the Western Pacific, and then two of the hotspots that we have, of course, are North Korea and Taiwan. I have this slide up here about the Indo-Pacific Command. This is the U.S. military command that covers all of Asia and the Pacific. It's headquartered in Honolulu, Hawaii, where I live. So we see a lot of maneuvering that's going around between Pearl Harbor Naval Base and lots of submarines and aircraft carriers and other naval things, as well as the 25th Infantry Division that's located in Hawaii, and a big Marine base there too. So this is where the kind of the headquarters for all of the U.S. Military operations in Asia and the Pacific. Here are some of the places in Asia and the Pacific where the U.S. has bases. Japan, South Korea, Guam, Philippines, Thailand, in and out of Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, in and out of New Zealand, not a firm base there, but we do have military operations that go through there. And then you look on what else is there besides the U.S. Well, of course, the countries that are the region, China, Japan, Korea. And when you think about all of the military hardware that is out in the Western Pacific, from the Chinese, who say this is our front yard, we have every right to have military naval vessels in the South China Sea. You've got Australia that has their vessels. You've got the Philippines that have theirs, South Korea, Japan, and Russia. Sometimes we forget that the eastern side of Russia is on the Pacific, and they have a large naval base in Vladivostok, and the Kamchatka Peninsula has military things there. But so this is just to kind of give you an idea of even more things that are out in the Western Pacific. For the United States, we have a lot of military and civilian personnel that are assigned in the Pacific. 375,000 military and civilian personnel. The U.S. Pacific Fleet has over 200 ships, 1,100 aircraft. We've got Marines, we've got Air Forces, 46,000 airmen, 86,000 Marines. The U.S. Army has 106,000 personnel, 2 divisions, 300 aircraft, and 1,200 special operations personnel. So there's a lot of people that are involved in the U.S. military policies for the Western Pacific. And I'll just mention one of the big exercises, military exercises, that we have every year that's run out of Hawaii is called Rim of the Pacific, or Rim Pack, which is a massive this last year, we had 26 countries participating, over 25,000 military personnel on 38 ships, 4 submarines, 170 aircraft, and now 9 nations were a part of doing ground maneuvers in Hawaii. We also had, and this is an interesting part of this, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is moving into the Pacific. So in that Rim Pack military exercises, we had 8 NATO countries that were a part of the Rim Pack operation: Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, as well as the US as being a NATO country, and 4 Pacific partners and 1 Latin American partner. That they're not full members of NATO, but they're partners of NATO, which means they kind of do whatever NATO wants them to do. And those partners are Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand. And then in Latin America, Colombia is a NATO partner. And then you see in the latter part of this, non-NATO countries that participated in the Rim Pack, which were Brunei, Chile, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Israel, Malaysia, Portugal, Peru, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Tonga. So I mean, it's pretty darn incredible when you think of all of these countries that are getting together to do war maneuvers in the Pacific. And when all of these ships come into Pearl Harbor, Honolulu, to go onto the base and see the huge numbers of huge ships that are there that are stand for nothing but war. It's just, you just think, what a waste, what a waste. And how does that appear when you think out in the Western Pacific from China? How does China see what the U.S. is doing? And you can see how they can look at all of the American flags everywhere that the U.S. has as the U.S. has staked out its empire all over the world. And so the Chinese see all of that and are wondering what does the U.S. mean, and considering some of the things that the U.S. has been doing, and as the title of this talk was, some provocative actions, the Chinese, I think, rightfully are wondering what the U.S. is doing, and particularly in one particular place, Taiwan, the small island off the coast of the mainland of China. In China, though, we don't really think about how many military bases they have. And this is, I'm sure it's not a complete listing of all of them, but it is interesting to see what kind of air bases they have, where they are, what kind of naval forces they have. Just this count right here would be probably about 20. In the United States and the continental United States, we have over 200 U.S. military bases. The U.S. is by far the most militarized country in the world. And when you look at the population of the countries of the biggest militaries, India has 1.4 billion citizens, 1.42 billion. China comes in second, just below that, with 1.425 billion. And the United States is the next one at 339,000, which is like 1/4, 25% of the population of either China or India. And yet when we look at where the largest militaries are in the world, China, with its massive population of 1.4 billion people, has an active duty military of 2 million people. And here we have India that has 1.4 million. The United States that has 1/4, or 25% of the population of both India and China. We have almost 1.4 million people on active duty. So proportionally, we have a massive military compared to how the Chinese and the Indians have structured their military forces. But looking back at that population map, should there be a conflict, both India and China have huge, huge numbers of people that they can draw from to ramp up their military very, very quickly. The U.S. has a certain number of reserves, but as we hear from the news, the U.S. military is having a very difficult time recruiting. Particularly the U.S. Army, which is I think it's 50,000. They are under 50,000 of what their goal has been for the last 2 years. And you look at military expenditures and going through the world, the United States with 877 billion is more than the next 10 countries combined, as I'm sure all of you all have heard. But when we look at what China has, which is almost 300 billion, which is 1/3 of what the United States has. Russia, a modest amount, one would say, 86 billion. The United States by far spends more money on its military than any other country. And with a population of 1/4 of what the other larger countries have, it is an abomination what we are doing, and what and I know many of you all are part of groups that really go after the U.S. government for its and Congress for continuing to vote for these massive, massive military expenditures. It's outrageous, and we have to just keep after them and shame them for what they're doing. The U.S. Has over 800 bases around the world, and China has a few bases. It started digging around on some of the atolls in the South China Sea. They've now put airstrips on 9 of the atolls and built them up into one would call them military bases. And of course, this has caused controversy in the region, because some of the atolls are, several other countries say, wait a minute, those are international atolls. You shouldn't be taking those, like Vietnam and the Philippines. And so that's one of the friction points in the region. We were talking about Taiwan, as being one of the hot spots. Just to put it kind of in perspective of what Taiwan is, Taiwan has, I think, 28 million people, or 23 million, pardon me, 23 million, small, very small, smaller than many of the cities in the United States and capitals of the world. But it is the 21st largest economy in the world because of all of the IT things and superconductors and things like that. Interestingly enough, its major export country is China. So when the United States keeps going after and saying, Taiwan, we'll protect Taiwan, we'll do all of this stuff. And I think a lot of people in Taiwan are going, well, wait a minute, what are you all talking about? We don't really think the PRC, the communist Chinese, the mainland Chinese, are actually going to invade us. I mean, we export so much stuff to them. The status quo has been pretty darn good for the last 40 years since the one China policy that the U.S. finally kind of signed on to, which kind of holds its nose that Taiwan is not an independent country, although there are still like 6 countries of the world that do recognize Taiwan, the Republic of China, rather than the People's Republic of China. But of course, the PRC is tempting those remaining countries with all sorts of deals if they will go ahead and take the recognition off Taiwan and put it back into the PRC. But when you look at it, the Taiwanese have invested strongly into the mainland China. There are over $200 billion of investment that the Taiwanese have put into mainland, and over 4,000 Taiwanese enterprises. So it's not like the Taiwanese are. They definitely don't want to be a formal part of the PRC, but the status quo is something that has worked well for them. And the meddling of the United States is just causing tensions that can really destabilize and are destabilizing the relationship, which has been going on for 40 years. One of those things that Biden and his administration, and it started kind of with Trump, Biden saying that U.S. forces would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Well, the Chinese have said, we're not invading anybody, for God's sakes. Although in July of last year, Chairman Xi warned President Biden, apparently in a phone call, saying, you're playing with fire. If you all keep prodding this thing of Taiwan, saying that we, the mainland Chinese, are about ready to invade China or invade Taiwan. So watch out, you're playing with fire. And some of the things that the United States has done, some of the aggressive things that we, the United States, have done, is the number of U.S. aircraft carrier groups. And a carrier group is not just an aircraft carrier that will have like 50 or 60 planes on it, but there's usually a group of at least 10 surface ships and a couple of submarines that go along with every aircraft carrier. And these carrier groups have been going on what's called freedom of navigation missions to say to everybody, the seas are open and we can go anywhere we want to. Well, that's that's true, but you don't need to just keep pushing it in the face of the Chinese. And if the Chinese brought one of its 2 aircraft carriers, they only have 2 aircraft carriers. The United States has 13, one of them out of commission at the moment. But if the Chinese would bring, 50 ships and be 20 miles offshore the United States, I think the US would be a little bit peeved about that. And the United States has been sending senior level military and diplomats. The highest ranking diplomat in 40 years has gone to Taiwan purposely. Senior congressional officials, when Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, you all probably remember this. This was a big deal that Nancy had said she's going to Taiwan. The White House said, well, we didn't okay it. The Chinese were just apoplectic about the Speaker of the House of Representatives going there, and she went anyway. We've also had high-level U.S. military officers that have gone. It's one thing I'm sure there have been people that have gone before, but it wasn't publicized the way it is now. Publicity kind of in the face of the mainland Chinese, like, we don't care what you think, we're doing what we want to do no matter what. The United States has been providing military trainers. We've been selling military equipment to Taiwan for decades. That was apparently one of the little loopholes in the one China policy, that the US could continue to supply, not on grants, but the Taiwanese have to pay for this. And the latest thing is a $619 million sale that US weapons manufacturers love, and they're one could argue that they're kind of behind a lot of the US military policies and foreign policies, that they make a killing out of this. And the 200 anti-aircraft missiles and all of this stuff that, manufacturers love it. So the merchants of death, the merchants of war, love this relationship. Just today came out an article saying the U.S. is fast tracking $500 million for armaments to go into Taiwan. And this, that headline itself, when you put it out like that, the mainland Chinese are going, well, what the hell's going on with this? I mean, so, it's a dangerous game that the U.S. is playing here. Not only were these those missiles going in, but they're doing special operations, counterinsurgency sort of things, mock invasions, and publicizing them. The NATO is getting involved in it too. Here you have a top EU diplomat calling for a European Navy patrol. Like, why don't you just keep your Navy over in the Atlantic and leave the Pacific alone? But that's not what's happened. France and the UK have sent aircraft carriers into the Western Pacific at the request of the United States. So, that it's really becoming quite a crowded area. When I was putting this together, I thought, well, I'll just mention that I have been to Taiwan. And in 2013, I went on what was called the Peace Boat. It's a Japanese boat that takes trips around the world, taking the 2,000 passengers, the paying passengers, peace activists, or people that want to go to areas and learn more about them. They had asked me to be a speaker on part of this trip that went from Japan up to South Korea. 500 Japanese were on the boat. Then we went up to South Korea to pick up 500 South Koreans. And then we went down to Okinawa, then Taiwan, and then to Shanghai, China. And I mention that because we didn't stay long in Taiwan. I didn't get to go see any of the semiconductor factories or any of the big economic and business part of Taiwan. We were doing more of the cultural part of it, but you could get a sense of how small the place is. It's a small island. It's not a huge place, but it did move us on to the going into China. The peace boat went up the Yangtze River to Shanghai, and that trip was a real eye opener. The areas for the miles and miles and miles through the Yangtze Delta, and then all the way as the river got smaller and smaller and smaller, all along the banks, on both sides of the banks, were huge container docks. And if you think about all of the stuff that the United States and the rest of the world buys from industries in China, they ship it out. And man, they have world-class facilities of shipping things out. They have the world's largest and most advanced automatic terminals. And another part of their economic reach, and all of this is to say, why in the world is the United States saying China is our enemy, when if the Chinese would stop sending stuff to us, we'd be naked in 2 months. I mean, it's just crazy what our policy toward China is becoming. And the Chinese at any moment could just get so fed up with what everybody's doing that they could just stop international commercial shipping. Most people don't realize that Chinese companies, there are 3 of them, operate the port facilities, the major port facilities in Germany and Greece, the Netherlands, France, Malta, Israel, Sweden, Poland, and even in Australia, in Darwin, Australia, the port facility in Darwin, the US military apparently didn't ask like who's in charge of this port, thinking probably it's the Australians, but no, they leased it to a Chinese company. And so the US has now built fuel storage facilities for 60 million gallons of fuel right next to the port that the Chinese have the lease on. So here you're talking about war with the Chinese, and all the Chinese have to do is just kind of, close the gate up to that fuel farm, and that's the end of that. Well, not necessarily, but it's a crazy part of this. And I was mentioning, on the peace boat, the captain of the ship let me come up to the bridge of the ship as we were starting up through Yangtze Delta, so I could see what was there. And the captain apologized. He said, I really can't talk much with you because, as you can see, all of these little boats that are coming from both sides of the river, there are thousands of these boats, and I'm trying not to run over anybody. I'm just trying to, slowly go through here. And as on every side of the boat, there were 10 or 15 boats, some of them small cargo ships, some of them fishing vessels. And then when you would look over toward the land, here were all of these industries that were along there. I mean, it's a huge, busy place. And here's some more of the views of some of the ships that were out there. And when you think about the number of ships that China has to take the goods that they produce to buyers all over the world, and then you think of all the fishing vessels that they have to bring fish back to 1.4 billion people. I mean, if they wanted to, they could put a blockade around Taiwan with just their little vessels, big vessels. They could circle Taiwan and bring it all the way back to the mainland China. They have huge numbers of vessels. And the United States, we're having difficulty building a new one every 5 years. But their facilities for manufacturing of ships and their ability to get them out all over the world is incredible. The Chinese corporations operate more shipping ports than any other country, including 7 of the busiest ports in the world. They own over 100 ports or lease, I would say leasing is probably the better word, in 63 countries. And there are 3 terminal operators. This Costco China Ocean Shipping Company, which is not quite the same as our Costco here in the US, I don't think. And then China Merchants Group and this thing called CK Hutchison Holdings. So it's really interesting to do. All you have to do is Google it and all this stuff will come up. It's just that I don't think any of our diplomats have Googled it for the amount of trouble that they are causing for the relationship with China, which, as I mentioned before, all they have to do is just say, "Yep, port's closed." And that would really disrupt so much of the life of the world. I'll move on down to Australia, though. Just this last year, a big brouhaha where the United States and the UK convinced Australia to dump a contract for submarines that the Australians had with the French. But secretly behind the back of the French, the US and the UK got the Australians to join up with this thing called AUKUS, Australia, UK, and US. And so now the nuclear powered submarines will be built by the UK and the US, which has really torpedoed relations with France. So the Talisman Sabre that I was mentioning before, this military exercise of in 2000, well, this slide actually says it's, well, ground force is 17,000, but the total is 33,000 people will be coming to that military exercise that goes on in late July. And in 2021, it was a smaller one, because it was kind of COVID related. But you can see the breakdown. About half the number were Australians, half Americans, and then you had a variety of other folks that were there. This year it's going to be 30,000 to 33,000. And again, the NATO countries are coming in for this war maneuver in the Pacific. And the NATO countries of France, the UK, Canada, and Germany are going to participate. Why France is participating, I don't know, after what the Australians did to them. They may be sending one person as an observer. The bottom line, though, is stop NATO in the Pacific. Don't let NATO do to the Pacific what NATO has done to the Atlantic and Europe. And in fact, we have a petition, which is cancel Talisman Sabre and cancel the AUKUS. And I've got the petition here, but I'll put it in the chat in a few minutes so that if you sign it, we have about, we just put it up a couple of days ago, and we've got, I think, about 2,000 signatures, but we'd like to get up to 10,000 or more. And we intend to send copies of the petition to all of the countries there. Going to another place in the Pacific where new things have happened. After many years, almost 2.5 decades, the U.S. has not had military bases in the Philippines. We now do. Here's the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who was there earlier this year, and signing deals where the U.S. will have like 6 different military installations that it can use in military maneuvers. Of course, the Chinese have come out in opposition to that presence in the Philippines. We go up a little bit further, though, up into South Korea, and the issue of the threats of some sort of a military confrontation between South Korea and the U.S. and North Korea. And here again, the U.S. After the one thing I'll give President Trump credit for, and this is about the only one, is that he did meet with Kim Jong-un, the chairman in North Korea, for 3 times. And I think they were pretty close to coming to some sort of an agreement until the war hawks really took him down. During that 3-year period, though, there were no U.S. and South Korean military exercises, land exercises, and the North Koreans did not test any nuclear weapons, and they did not fire any of their ballistic missiles. So talking with people, talking with adversaries can work. And that's not what we're doing right now. And instead, in South Korea, the U.S. has docked nuclear submarines in South Korea for the first time in 40 years. We've had large-scale live fire exercises and the largest number of U.S. military aircraft going into and flying right along the DMZ. The president, the right-wing president, Yoon of South Korea, visited Washington just a couple of weeks ago, and out came what's called the Washington Statement, where the U.S. and South Korea have formed a very public major alliance. I mean, we've always had an alliance, but this is, one step above it, which to the North Koreans, I mean, when the Washington Statement was signed, the North Koreans fired off like 8 different missiles to let people know, well, we don't like that. And, as a former diplomat, I just can't believe that the United States is not attempting to lessen the tensions. This is the 70th anniversary of the armistice. July 27th, 1953 is when the brutal 3-year Korean War ended. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., on July 27th, there will be a national mobilization for people coming to Washington to say to the U.S. government, you've got to start working on ending, the confrontation. So if any of you all are available, we'd love to have you. Women Cross the DMZ, a group that I went to North Korea with in 2015, and we had a peace conference with over 250 North Korean women, and then we went to Kaesong in this near the DMZ and had another peace conference with more North Korean women. And we've met with North Korean women in Bali and in Beijing. There are efforts, citizen efforts to try to let the North Koreans know that, not all Americans think they're idiots and are dangerous, but we're having a difficult time getting our government to help on this. So the mobilization on July 27th and 28th will be a very good time. On the 28th, we'll have a conference at George Washington University with some excellent world-renowned historians and people that have worked on nuclear issues. And I'll also put in the chat, and I will list it on the recording that we send out after this. The agreements that were signed in January and then reconfirmed in the discussions with President Biden and President Yoon. So there were a lot of them, and I'll send this around too, so you can read them in detail. Then we also have Japan. The United States has been urging Japan to dump its Article 9, the article in their constitution that actually the U.S. wrote into it back after World War II, that the Japanese military would be a self-defense force and would not be an offensive force. It would be a defense force. And the U.S. has been trying to get that Article 9, torpedoed. The U.S. has continued a major military presence on the island of Okinawa, a place that has 5 major U.S. military bases, and all of the pollution and contamination that goes with it, to including the PFAS, PFAS, forever chemicals that are there. The Japanese are putting missiles out on some of the outlying islands of around Okinawa. That is one of the places that has some of the most sophisticated U.S. military materiel in the Western Pacific. And the people of Okinawa don't like it. They're fed up with it. And particularly when the U.S. decided it would build a runway in Hanoko Bay, Ora Bay, in a pristine area, and the U.S. has just decimated a very beautiful area of the seas around Okinawa. Going out into other hotspots, and I'll go through this kind of quickly, but the Solomon Islands has become a hotspot because the U.S. hasn't had an embassy there, and the Chinese went in and signed a security agreement with the government of the Solomon Islands, and all of a sudden Washington was aghast. So they have now sent a tiny team into the Solomon Islands to have a micro embassy in the Solomon Islands to counter what the Chinese are doing, which is what they're doing is going out in their own front yard and making alliances with folks. So reading up about what's happened there is very interesting. Another place of hotspots for the U.S. military is the tiny island of Guam that has a naval base. It has nuclear submarines in it. It has a major Air Force base, Anderson Air Force Base, where B-52s and all sorts of aircraft are flying in and out. And it also has the newest Marine base in the world. The Marines had not constructed a new base in something like 50 years, and they've now made a new base in Guam because they are going to have to move some of the Marines that are on Okinawa because of the citizen outrage of people of Okinawa who want U.S. military out of there. And so finally, the U.S. has said, okay, we'll move some of our Marines out. And they're coming to the island of Guam, which is going to increase the population of Guam, by like 5% without any infrastructure development of new roads, new water, and of course the attendant problems with live fire ranges, artillery, and then going into the other islands that are in the Northern Marianas, Tinian and Saipan, all of those islands being affected by the increased militarization of the U.S. out in the Western Pacific. Aircraft carriers come into little tiny Guam and completely, you can see right here, they just completely overwhelm the place. A missile defense system now that's going into Guam because it was a place that was mentioned by Kim Jong-un back in the fire and fury days of Donald Trump before they started exchanging love letters. Kim Jong-un said, we've got weapons that can actually hit Guam. And so now the U.S. is putting a missile defense system into Guam. Another part of that area is the Marshall Islands, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia. I actually was a U.S. diplomat out in the Federated States of Micronesia for 2 years. The U.S. was the trustee for the UN Trust territories after World War II. And then these 3 entities became independent countries, each one of them with less than 100,000 people in it. But the U.S. continues to, or the U.S. wants the defense rights, the ability to say who can fly into the area, what ships can come into the area, and to get the agreement, the U.S. has a compact of free association, which is being negotiated right now. And those 3 countries have the U.S. kind of over the barrel. And the U.S., our taxpayer money is going to be increased going out there because the U.S. feels this is important to keep. And those islands are saying, yeah, we're important and we need to have a little more respect from you all rather than just military folks flying in and out. And we need some more money. So that's what's happening there. The Marshall Islands is the place where the U.S. Blew up over 60 nuclear weapons back in the 1950s. And the residue from that, still the harm for the people of the Marshall Islands is quite pronounced there. It's also the place where the Ronald Reagan ballistic missile range, the end of it, missiles fired from Vandenberg, California, fly all the way across the Pacific and then land out by the Marshall Islands. So all of this very interesting parts. Now, I've got a lot of resources that are there, and if anybody wants this, we'll add it to the list of things that we'll be sending you. So I hope that's been useful to you and gives you a little bit of a flavor of what is going on in the Western Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was so much information and incredible. Thank you. We have a little bit of time left for Q&A, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mark Elliott Stein at World Beyond War, who is going to facilitate the Q&A. So go ahead, Mark.
All right, thank you. And that was incredible and so informative and really so shocking to see how bad things are getting. We have a lot of questions. I think we'll just, ask these directly to you. The first is from Al Midi. Hi, Al. And we only hear that Taiwan feels threatened by China. What does the press in Taiwan say about the threat? What do polls of Taiwanese people report?
Well, that's a very good question. And, we've had the president of Taiwan that was in Washington at the White House not too long ago. I think what we have to evaluate, I'm not too sure on what the polls are saying, quite honestly. But I think what we have to evaluate is very carefully, who is getting polled and what it's all about. As I mentioned, the numbers of the economic reality that so much of Taiwan's economy depends on China is a very important part of it. So I don't have a clear answer to that, Alan. My apologies.
Don Smith asked a similar question, and specifically, what are the positions of political parties and are there robust opposition groups? And if I may, let me throw in my question as an addendum to Don's. I'm guessing that it's a very wealthy country due to its small population and gigantic economic, dominance of semiconductors. So does the wealth of Taiwan tilt its political opinion? That's sort of my addendum to Don's question. What, is there opposition? Are there movements in Taiwan?
Yes, there are movements, and the party in power, as in every place, I think the way I interpret it is, countries can always help jack up the involvement of other countries by making sure everybody is well aware of a potential threat to them. And that's really what this whole thing about the US selling all this weapons, the potential threat. Now, whether or not it is a potential threat, but what are are they saying it's going to be like 90% sure that China's going to invade us, or is it going along as it has been for the last 40 years, kind of the status quo where everybody kind of stays where they are? The US government, of course, is noted for its history of helping stir up trouble in countries. And I think that's probably going on there a little bit as we speak. I have no doubts that the US has its hand in working with groups to stir up anti-mainland Chinese fervor.
Right. Well, thank you. Let's keep moving. This is from Larry. Larry, of course, if you feel like you can ask it yourself, but I think to save time, let me just keep moving forward. Larry says, I was talking to a man who now lives here in the Villages, Florida, who told me he was originally from Taiwan. I asked him if he thought China might attack Taiwan. He said no. He said the Chinese will not attack other Chinese. Have you heard anything like that?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, if the Chinese wanted to, they could overwhelm that place so quickly. It's a very narrow strait across from the mainland. The Chinese don't have the same history as the United States in its warmongering, although it certainly has done some. And human rights issues, they're certainly there. But China hasn't, well, you can argue Tibet, you can argue incursions into around Laos, Vietnam, and that area back in the 70s. But generally, China has not been a warmonger like the United States has. And I think the Chinese know the history of their own country and both political parts, whether it be the communist government of the mainland or the non-communist government of Taiwan. They don't have that recent history of so much warring. And I do think that they recognize the humanity of both of the Chinese that are on that live in Taiwan, that have a different political system, but still they're Chinese. So I tend to agree with the man that Larry had talked with in the villages.
This is sort of my own question, because I think we will have time for the other questions. So I have often noticed how little cultural interchange there is between at least my part of the world, the United States, and China. Like when I hear people talk about what they perceive Chinese culture to be, they perceive it as very totalitarian. And really, when I ask, well, what do you think people, what do people do for fun in China? What are marriages like in China? What are families like? People have no idea. We don't see movies in China. We don't read books from China. We don't see TV shows from China. To me, this is one obvious reason why, there's nothing but fear between us and China. What can we do about that? And do you agree with that? And are you closer? Being in Hawaii, hopefully you are closer than we feel here.
Yeah, well, it's a very valid point. I mean, the number of US citizens that actually have traveled to mainland China or to Taiwan is low, very, very low. There are probably more Chinese that come to the US or did come to the US before COVID, and then before all of this hoopla about China as our enemy. I mean, there were over 500,000 Chinese students studying in the United States each year for the last decade. The Chinese know much more about the United States, and they weren't all spies or anything like that. These are kids that were getting an education.
Oh, sorry. And as a software developer, I have often worked with Chinese nationals who come here and work here. And I find that they are very surprised to be asked any questions, and usually feel that they must be very polite in their answers about Chinese-US relations. And under that politeness, I sense a lot of conflict.
Well, that's probably true. That's probably true. I mean, I think they are watching their P's and Q's when they're in the United States. It's not like China is I mean, there are issues there where Chinese are watched. They have one of the biggest surveillance systems in the world. You talk about cameras everywhere, they have them. It's a part, I don't agree with it, but when you look at the industrialization of China, when you look at the infrastructure of China, I mean, it puts the United States to shame. When we can't even get an Arcella train going more than 50 miles an hour between Washington and New York City, and they have probably, I think it's now 80 bullet trains that go 280 kilometers an hour. I've been on them from Shanghai to Nanjing. I've been to China probably 8 times in the last 8 years. So I've seen a lot of it. I've seen the development of it. It is truly unbelievable. When you go to the city of Shanghai, it puts New York City in its place. I mean, New York is fantastic, but Shanghai is fantastic too.
Well, this is a good transition to Liz's question. Liz Remerswal. Hi, Liz. What do you say to those who say that the Chinese are investing in infrastructure in many countries, sharing this miracle of improvement in an effort to indebt them?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the classic thing that the US government has done for decades. The Chinese call it the Belt and Road Initiative, where they help build roads, they help build railroads, they help build ports, they help build, you name it. And of course, there's a cost to it. Countries that want these things, just like with the US, there are costs of that. If you get a loan from the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, there are ties to it. But the Chinese have developed a remarkable Belt and Road thing that is connecting China with Europe through road systems that go through Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, all the way out. They've developed a major port in Pakistan. It's quite remarkable. They did the railroad. In fact, I wish we could get Chinese to come to Honolulu to finish our light rail system that's taken 12 years and over budget by 5 billion%. And the Chinese could have gotten it done in 1 year. I mean, they know what they're doing on infrastructure, and they're doing it well, but it's not free.
Agreed about infrastructure here too. Yay, capitalism. Everything's crumbling. Here, this is a question from Al Midi. With China's projected economic growth, why would China want to disrupt the world with a war that would negatively impact their economy? China may beat the US at capitalism.
Well, the Chinese have never said they want a war. It's the US that seems to be saying that they want a war. I don't think the Chinese at all want conflict. It's the US that's being provocative. It's not the Chinese that are coming into the waters of the United States or that. It's the US that is just coming up with all of these little pushes and prods for both China and for North Korea, and the same way they did it for Russia on the Ukraine thing. It's a very dangerous foreign policy that we have now. And we've seen it explode in Europe, where tragically tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine and Russia have been killed on a senseless, useless war that has to be brought to an end. And we certainly don't want anything like that to start out in the Pacific. So I would appeal to everyone to do what you can. Let your Congress people know that you don't want war with China, that China is not our enemy. In fact, there are a couple of things we can mention. And if you happen to be in Australia on July 29th through about August 4th, we do have a mobilization in Australia on the Talisman Sabre. We do have the mobilization in Washington about the same time, the 27th of July, on peace on the Korean Peninsula. No to NATO has an event in July 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th in Brussels, Belgium. And then there is peace in Ukraine, a peace summit in Vienna, Switzerland. So there are a lot of things that people are doing to call attention to all of these hotspots and dangerous areas of our world. And we hope you all will join us.
And we will be sending links to these. I want to ask just one more question, and then I'm going to hand this back to Larry if he has any last words. I think we should mention BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is being mentioned as a sort of way to balance, towards a multipolar world. Anything, I just think in this context, are you aware of this trend of challenging the dollar hegemony of the US dollar, et cetera, Ann?
Well, yes, it certainly is an important aspect of this, where you have the largest countries of the world, really, that are coming together to say, this is crazy. We're not going to go along with what the US and the Western powers are essentially holding us hostage. I mean, when you look at all the sanctions that have been put on China, Russia, they are looking for a different financial economic system that will that they can use, that they are not dependent on the system that's really screwing them right now. So I think it's something to really keep a watch for, because they don't intend to go under just because the West says you're competing too successfully with us and we're going to bring you down. And they're not going down.
As somebody who's been inside the United States power structure more than many of us, do you think the West was ready for the emergence of competition to US dollar hegemony? Were they prepared for this? How will the West react?
Well, you can see how they're reacting. They just keep putting sanctions on people, saying this is the the non-lethal way to get people to do what we want. And when, in fact, talking to people, ironing out issues, talking about problems, working through them without, with respect for the positions that countries come into these things with, that's kind of what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is not diplomacy by gun, which is the way we seem to be doing it tragically.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for the questions. I'll hand this back to Larry. Or Greta.
Unmute. I had to unmute. So, well, I want to thank Greta and Mark for the aspects of making this thing work because I'm technically challenged. And thank you. And Ann, it was a pleasure to have met you. I had heard a lot about you prior to going to Creech Air Force Base, where we participated together in opposition to the killer drones, where they're, flying these things out of there and the training there. And so, and I thank you for taking the time to do this. I know that grass doesn't grow under your feet, as we have seen where you're going to be going in the next few months. So I want to thank you. I admire you for standing up for peace, and a fellow member of World Beyond War and Veterans for Peace. I admire you greatly, and I want to thank you for doing this. And I'll let you finish with the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the kind invitation to be here, and I hope this was useful to everyone. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
night.
Thank you.
Goodbye.